plan to build a black college in the United States comes the very year of Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831. The first college, actually, if you look off to the left, the first college was supposed to be in New Haven. In 1831 in New Haven, a group of white abolitionists and black abolitionists, the white abolitionists mostly from New England, including William Lloyd Garrison, the famous editor of The Liberator, the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and Arthur Tappan, the wealthy New York merchant and Connecticut resident, had joined with a group of black ministers, mostly from New York City, from Manhattan, with a plan to build an advanced school for African Americans. And the idea was really quite simple, that the free black population could not effectively protect itself, nor could it effectively resist slavery, mount opposition to the enslavement of other black people throughout the United States, if it couldn't produce a professional class, if it actually couldn't produce an educated class of people. And in fact, for me, the book, Ebony and Ivy, began with that. I had moved from Williams College to Dartmouth College in 2002, and I had begun to write what was supposed to be a tiny little article. It was supposed to be a really simple project. And all I was going to do was explain how black abolitionists, the African Americans who opposed slavery in the decades before the Civil War, particularly the New York group, how they became professionals in a nation where they couldn't attend college. So how do you become a minister, a teacher, a doctor in a nation where you couldn't attend college, if you were excluded from universities? And the answer seemed to be pretty simple. I knew that some of them had, James McCune Smith, one of the leading abolitionists of that period, McCune Smith at the age of 17 is put on a boat in around 1832 on a ship from New York City that goes to Scotland, and he enrolls at the University of Glasgow. And in 5 years, he earns 3 degrees, the Bachelor of Arts, the Master of Arts, and the Doctor of Medicine. Yes, exactly. In fact, whenever my students ask me for an extension, I tell them the story of Dr. James McCune Smith, and then ask them, do you really want an extension? Would you really feel good about yourself if you took an extension? They say yes, but McCune Smith had gone to Scotland, and in fact, actually one white abolitionist, William Jay, would later record just before the Civil War that probably fewer than a dozen black people had actually managed to find college education by the eve of the Civil War. Many of them had actually gone to Europe to study, oddly enough. France, Scotland, England, some in Holland, certainly the Netherlands had actually taken quite a few. Within the United States itself, however, the black population that managed to access higher education is relatively small. In 1831, the abolitionists actually set out to respond to this. And the New Haven College, the idea was supposed to be to establish a black college in New Haven. It would have, most of the trustees of the school would be African Americans. The majority of the board would be black. The school would be open to students of any race, but it would be a black college. The white abolitionists were going to raise $10,000, and the black abolitionists were going to match that $10,000. And that would become the initial endowment for the school. They were so excited about this prospect that they brought it to the first National Negro Convention, the National Conventions of Free Black People that started being held in Philadelphia the prior year. And so at the very first of these conventions, the plan was presented to the delegates, and they approved the plan for the college in New Haven. With that endorsement, the abolitionists then went out. Arthur Tappan actually bought the property for the college. Garrison actually visited the land and described it as the most beautiful part of the city that's available, and was delighted at the prospects of this new school. But in fact, actually, just a few days before the project was really supposed to take off, the town council, led by New Haven Mayor Dennis Kimberly, actually held a town meeting to attack the school. They described it as a threat to Yale and the prosperity of Yale. They described it as a threat to New Haven that would attract unwanted colored people into the state. They added that slavery no longer existed in Connecticut, and therefore abolitionists weren't necessary there, and they had no place there. But they did something else that was critically important in the history of anti-literacy and anti-education, anti-free black policy. They described free black students as a threat and a danger to the moral economy of New Haven. They suggested, in fact, that the black students would prey upon white people, that young black men would prey upon white women in particular, and that the moral purity of Connecticut would be compromised. In fact, that body of thought, the way in which they articulated their campaign against the school, becomes critical to the anti-abolitionist campaign, the campaign to stop the destruction of slavery. Anti-abolitionism in the North, in fact, was in many ways the refining event for anti-literacy in the South. 2 years later, the New Haven school is actually ultimately abandoned because of the extraordinary opposition of the mayor, the town council, and that town meeting. And they begin looking, the abolitionists begin looking for another project. And in that middle image is Prudence Crandall, a young white woman living and teaching in Canterbury, Connecticut, who was running a school for young women, when in 1832 she's visited by Sarah Fayerweather, a young black woman who also lives in the neighboring town. Sarah Fayerweather, who's about 17 at the time, visits her and actually asks if she can attend the school. And Crandall, as she describes it, goes into prayer about the request. She knows that she wants to bring her in. She started reading Garrison's Liberator. She's been attracted to the anti-slavery movement, but she also recognizes that there'll be a lot of hostility toward her if she admits a black student. Sarah Fayerweather comes back and makes a second request, and Crandall accepts her as a student. What then ends up happening is that almost immediately, Crandall gets a visit from the best women in town. Wearing white gloves for tea, they tell her, in fact, that if the black girl stays, they'll withdraw their daughters from the school and ruin her. In a panic, Crandall leaves town looking for support. She heads out to Boston to meet with William Lloyd Garrison. She heads south from there to Newport and Providence, Rhode Island, where there was a fairly large free black population with an active anti-slavery tradition. She then goes to New York City to meet with the same black ministers who had been part of the plan for the Black College in New Haven. And let me point out that that attack on the Black College stops the first black college from being established in the United States by at least a quarter century. It means that the first black college won't come until the eve of the Civil War, rather than 1831. But she heads to New York City to meet with those black abolitionists. She gains their support, and on the ride back to Connecticut, she meets Arthur Tappan, the wealthy white abolitionist, who tells her not only will he support her plan, but if she'd like, he'll actually escort the girls to her house personally. Crandall then announces a school for young women of color and little misses of color, that she's actually going to teach black girls. She'll let the white girls leave, and she'll run a school for African-American girls. And in fact, African-American girls begin arriving from all of those towns that I described, from Philadelphia, from New York, from Providence, and from Boston. She begins getting black students. She also gets visited by the best men in town, who tell her that, in fact, if the black girls stay, not only will they ruin her school, they'll ruin her family's business, and they'll isolate her in town. The gossip about the arrival of black students is in fact extraordinary. If you read the diaries that, of the surviving diaries and letters of the residents of Canterbury at the time. Crandall actually is eventually put on trial. Connecticut passes a Black Act, an act that outlaws educating black people born from outside the state of Connecticut. They try her twice. In the second trial, the first time the jury splits. In the second trial, they actually move her to move the trial under a judge who was hostile to her, who escorts the jury toward a guilty verdict. In the third trial, she's appealing, and the appeal is eventually successful. While she's appealing, in fact, actually the townsmen break into her house, destroy the school, and ruin the experiment. In 1830, in Canaan, New Hampshire, if anyone knows New Hampshire, Canaan, New Hampshire is the town right next to Hanover, New Hampshire, where Dartmouth College is. It's the neighboring town. In Canaan, New Hampshire, in 1834, the townspeople announce actually that they're establishing a new school. And the school is actually going to be open to students of both sexes, and all races. The abolitionists then turned their attention toward Canaan as the project that they'll support. From New York City, actually, 3 young men go, Thomas Sidney, Henry Holland Garnett, and Alexander Crummell. Sidney will die relatively young, and so he's the less well-known of the 3. But Crummell and Garnett, Henry Holland Garnett becomes one of the most famous abolitionists in the United States, and he's the man when slavery ends at the end of the American Civil War. Garnett is the first black person to actually speak in Congress. He's invited, as a child, he was a fugitive slave to New York, and he's invited to actually give what's basically the eulogy for American slavery in Congress in 1865. Crummell becomes famous as an African missionary, but as teenagers, 16, 17, 18, they went from New York City to Canaan, New Hampshire, first on a ferry to the southern end of New England, and then on coaches. They left in January 1835 to get to the school, came to Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire. On the ferry out of New York, they were forced to ride outside in the January weather because Negroes were not allowed inside the compartments. And then on the stagecoaches from southern New England to Providence, from Providence to Boston, from Boston to Concord, from Concord to Hanover, from Hanover to Canaan. They were forced to ride on top of the coaches with the luggage because black people were not allowed to ride inside. Garnett had actually injured his leg, and it was lame. He walked with crutches. As a child, he was attempting at about 13 years old to help his family by going to work for a farmer on Long Island, and while he's there, he injures his leg. The leg is basically infected, and from that point on, it's not usable. By the time he arrived in Canaan, New Hampshire, he was barely able to limp into the building, and it took him several weeks to recover. The image that you're seeing there, and I'm going to go back to the original one, is just a reproduction of what happens several months later. In August 1835, after a series of rigged town meetings, in which the opposition to the school had managed to declare the school a danger to Canaan, to New Hampshire, and to the purity of the white race. A mob of 300 people descend on the town, August 10th, 1835. A mob of 300 people descend on the town with oxen, with 90 oxen, horses, chain, and rope. They dress the entire building in chains and rope. And then they rotate teams of men and oxen for the next 2 days to drag the school building through the town. About a mile through town to the plot of the Baptist church at the other end of Canaan. They drag it right up to the lake that's in Canaan and finish destroying the building there. After the great hauling was complete, they then took a cannon and firearms and began firing at the houses of any white people who had dared to board black students. Under cover of night, the abolitionists actually managed to secret the black children out of town. And the final experiment in the attempt to establish higher education for African Americans in the North is complete. That 13-year-old, Willis Augustus Hodges, to understand what the Hodges family went through in Virginia from 1829 to 1831, right after Nat Turner's rebellion, is to in fact understand the way in which the North participated in American slavery. The anti-literacy laws of the South, as they get re-articulated in the 19th century, in fact actually get much of their strength from the fact that Northerners were actively participating in a culture of racial suppression from which few black people would ever escape. Southern slavery couldn't work if there were havens for black people in the North. And one can see this actually in Canaan, New Hampshire, in an incident that's not related to the school at all. In fact, it happened 7 years earlier in 1828. The Canaanites build a brand new church, the North Congregational Church. It's still there now. If you ever pass through Canaan, you'll see it. And I should say they're lovely people now. But if you ever pass through Canaan, you'll see the North Church there. And in a town with no black residents. In fact, only one recorded black resident in all of its history, and he was there, a little boy who was brought to town as a slave a few decades earlier. In a town with no black people in it in 1828, the Canaan's residents went to the expense of building a segregated Negro section in the balcony of the church. Or in other words, they went to the expense of imposing the racial order on imagined diversity. Willis Augustus Hodges in New York became a member of the Abyssinian Baptist Church and an active abolitionist, that 13-year-old boy. In 1838, he bought land in the city of Williamsburg, which becomes later part of Brooklyn, where his brother William also owned property. A couple of years later, the brothers opened a grocery store. They quickly became leaders of the local black community, representing Williamsburg at state colored conventions and participating in many of the regional civil rights campaigns. The small free black enclave of Williamsburg included leading black activists like Thomas Van Rensselaer and the famous lecturer and teacher Maria Stewart, one of the black woman, widow of the War of 1812, who becomes famous in Boston for giving some of the earliest abolitionist speeches by an African-American woman that are recorded and still available to us today. In 1841, Willis Hodges helped move resolutions passed a local black community meeting, to sustain a school for African Americans in the village, and he and his brothers actually taught the school and sustained the enterprise by raising money in the local black community. In fact, Hodges, one of his great accomplishments will actually be this newspaper, which is now largely forgotten, Thomas Van Rensselaer and Frederick Douglass's The Ram's Horn, a black abolitionist paper published out of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I think this is actually one of just a handful of surviving pages of that paper. And so what do we take away from all this? The answer I would give you is actually the reason I tell that story and tell it that way is that I think it's important for audiences to remember the depth to which the North's investment in slavery continued long after the end of slavery in the North. In fact, the great subject or the great problem of Ebony and Ivy, that book I worked on for 11 years, is exactly that. To understand the relationship between the American university and American slavery is to understand the centrality of the American slavery to the rise and the prosperity of the United States. Harvard's relationship to slavery, Yale's relationship to slavery, Princeton's relationship to slavery is primarily important, in fact, because it tells us precisely about the centrality of slavery and the slave trade to the project of the United States and to all of its history. At the turn of the 20th century, Edwin Grant Dexter wrote a monumental history of American education in which he confidently asserted something that is, in fact, factually untrue. Quote, "The history of Negro education in the United States goes back no farther than the Civil War." He then proceeded to document the postbellum, the post-war federal officials and private agencies that controlled and planned Negro education in the South. In but a few words, in but a few sentences, Dexter had transformed the white American struggle to deny education into a far more palatable story of white people's efforts to bring education. He'd also erased the central role that African Americans played in the creation of universal public education and in crafting and articulating the purpose of democratic education in the United States. The complex pathology of racism, which comprises a destructive mixture of fear, greed, hate, ambition, and jealousy, was most frequently and consistently revealed in the struggle, the vast social investment in denying education to African Americans. A suspicion of their intellect, a thorough rejection of the idea of equality, and a lingering doubt about the spiritual and physical humanity of people with dark skin were the permanent legacies of America's direct and indirect encounters with enslaving other human beings. Racist ideologies evolved within a violent and oppressive social system, and institutions that threatened those social relations became the target of broad public outrage. Schools were one of the early sites of intellectual, cultural, and spiritual intercourse across national and racial lines. However, interracial encounters are more likely to be explored in the history of brothels, pubs, and gangs than in the lineage of schools, and Black people's impact on the nation more likely to be claimed in our cultural rather than in our intellectual legacies. For more than 3 centuries, schools, more than churches, jails, courts, or any other institution, have unsettled the class and race interest of the people who together built the United States. Thank you.